Hello, my name is John Olbrantz, and I'm the Mary Beth Collins Director of the Hallie Museum of Art at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this series of 4 virtual lectures being presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Forgotten Stories, Northwest Public Art of the 1930s, which continues through March 27, 2021 at the Hallie Museum of Art. Organized by curator Margaret Bullock for the Tacoma Art Museum, Forgotten Stories is the first major exhibition to celebrate the bounty of artwork created in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana under the New Deal federal art projects in the 1930s. Because of the current coronavirus pandemic and restrictions on social gatherings, and in order to help contextualize the exhibition, we've invited 4 humanities scholars to deliver virtual lectures on New Deal art, a history of the Depression, American literature in the 1930s, and science and technology during the Depression. The 4-part virtual lecture series, the first such lecture series that we've undertaken, has been made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency, and we're most grateful to them for their belief in our ability to carry out such an ambitious and technologically innovative series of lectures. On a local level, I want to thank Hallie Museum of Art Education Curator Elizabeth Garrison for organizing and coordinating the virtual lectures, and the staff of Allied Video Productions here in Salem for filming and editing the lecture series and getting the various lectures ready for broadcast. Today's speaker is Margaret Bullock. Margaret is currently the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington. Margaret holds a BA degree in art history, in English literature from the University of Colorado, an MA degree in anthropology from Washington State University, and an MA degree in art history from the University of Oregon. Prior to joining the Tacoma Art Museum in 2007, she was curator of the Harwood Museum of Arts in Taos, New Mexico, associate curator of American art at the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, and a research fellow at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts in Alabama. In addition, from 2009 to 2015, Margaret served as gallery manager and curator of the Kittredge Gallery at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. Over the years, Margaret has curated and written articles and books on European and American fine and decorative arts, including the full-color hardcover book that accompanies Forgotten Stories, and has a particular interest in the art of the Pacific Northwest. Please welcome Margaret Bullock.
Thank you for joining me today. Today I'll be discussing the federal government's New Deal art projects created during the Great Depression of the 1930s, and I'll be focusing specifically on their significance and impact here in the Pacific Northwest. The art projects were part of a much larger initiative created during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration of the 1930s. In 1929, the U.S. stock market suffered a major crash, and the U.S. went into a severe economic depression. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his new administration decided to create a number of programs to help stimulate the economy. And first, they were jobs that were for infrastructure projects. So they were things like building roads and dams. But they realized pretty quickly that there were a variety of people who were out of work, that didn't do that kind of work, and who really weren't capable of it. So they began to widen the jobs programs to include other kinds of skills. So you can see here in these images, on the left is an image of a group of people building a road, but on the right is a group of women in a sewing project. So they found different ways to use all sorts of different skills in these projects. And eventually, over time, Eleanor Roosevelt and others in the president's administration began to advocate for expanding the jobs programs to also include white-collar jobs and creative jobs. And they began to organize a group of projects that could pay artists to do their work, and the works would become property of the federal government. So in the image on the left that you're seeing right now, here's an artist who's doing a mural for a public housing project. And on the right is a painting that was done for a federal post office. So the idea was to get these works out into the public, make sure that everyone could see them, and that they were in places where anyone could have access to them. And that was really some of the impetus behind the projects, these ideas that they wanted to get across. They realized that art could really help with morale during a difficult time, that it might raise people's spirits and give them something interesting to look at, that it could help them remember why they were staying strong and what they were working toward by reminding them of maybe what their ancestors went through as pioneers, or showing them natural resources that they could rely on that would help the nation recover from the Depression. So the image on the right of farming in the Skagit Valley in Washington State is one of those images to remind people what they had to rely on. There was also a sort of sub-theme to it that the Roosevelt administration really wanted to get across to people the importance of culture in their life, and so have a shared national culture, and also to make sure that there was art available to everyone at every sort of level of society. There were 4 projects that were organized for the arts during this period of time. The first is called the Public Works of Art Project, or the PWAP, and it was very brief. It only ran for about 8 months, from late 1933 into the middle of 1934. And the idea was really just to get money into the hands of artists as quickly as they possibly could. So in some instances, they would go out and just buy a work from an artist from their studio, but in others, they'd commission work, again, for public buildings or tax-supported institutions. I'm showing you here a really glorious piece that's in the library at University of Oregon on their campus. The library was a new building that was being built, and so it was a great opportunity to put art into this important setting. The next 2 projects were for the decoration specifically of government buildings, things like post offices and courthouses and government office buildings. There were 2 projects that eventually became one. The first was called the Treasury Relief Art Project, or the TRAP in shorthand, and the other was called the Section of Fine Arts, or the Section. And they were both really about large-scale things for these buildings. So you'll see big sculpture, you'll see big murals. I'm showing you here a beautiful one from a post office in Bremerton, Washington. Again, that idea, it's a public building. Anyone who comes into the post office on their daily business is going to see this artwork. The Federal Art Project was the largest of all of these, and it ran the longest. It was organized to provide jobs of all kinds to artists of all kinds. So you'll see a great variety. As we go through these images in the talk, you'll see everything from what you would expect. There are paintings, there are prints, there are sculptures, but there are also illuminated manuscripts, there are dioramas, there are all sorts of different things that are generated under these projects. I'm showing you here some of that variety. On the left side is an image of a drawing that was done by an artist who was embedded in a camp for the Civilian Conservation Corps and who was just there to record daily life. So that was a way to take someone who was a professional illustrator and find them a place to be where they could do their work. The one on the right is a really magnificent piece that actually lives here in Salem at the Oregon State Library. And they asked an artist to do a map that included all of the flora of Oregon. So you can see all across the state the native plants that are here in the state. I mentioned Federal One, and that was the bigger umbrella that the art projects were organized under the WPA. And this included federal music, federal theater, and some other projects that just made sure that creative people of all kinds were finding some sort of support. And you often find that the art projects and the theater and music projects do things collaboratively. So artists, for example, would do sets for theater productions like the one in the image on the right, or they might do posters for the free concerts that were happening in the park from the Federal Music Project, like the image you see on the left, which is in Portland's Park Blocks. In the Northwest, they grouped together 4 states. It was Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And the way the projects ended, which was the U.S. entry into World War II, very abrupt, money withdrawn, many projects really closing literally overnight. There was a lot of confusion, records were lost, artwork went missing. And so in the Northwest, we have believed for a long time that really not much happened here, that it was very small. And then in the research that's been happening over the last decade or so, we found out that actually it was quite significant, and that these 4 states together pulled together a huge body of work, hundreds of artists, thousands of artworks. It was called Region 16, and the headquarters was actually in Portland, Oregon, in the building I'm showing you in the image on the left, which is a former Elks Temple, but it's now called the Princeton Building and is a hotel on 11th Street in downtown Portland. And it was where all the projects in all 4 of those states were run. And the portrait I'm showing you of Burt Brown Barker, he's sort of the hero of these projects. He was a public servant. He was a vice president for the University of Oregon, but he really believed in public service. And so he did his duties for the university for only $1 a month, and he signed on to the federal art projects for the same salary. So for years, he ran these enormous projects in 4 states for the token salary of $1 a year. So the projects look different in each of the states. So I'll start with talking about Idaho. And the project there was fairly small, at least so far as we've discovered. We haven't found a lot of artworks and a lot of artists, but there were works done for libraries and courthouses and post offices, as you might expect. And this is, the image I'm showing you is a mural that was in a former Boise Public Library. Still in the building's not a library anymore, but it's this really sort of wonderful fantasy about the story of the Little Mermaid. And I've talked with people who were children at the time that this mural was present, and they said it was always a little bit of a scandal because the mermaid had no clothes on, and so they'd go into the library and look at her and giggle all the time at this. But it was interesting to hear that too, because that meant the projects were really, the artists were allowed to do what interested them, and there wasn't a lot of oversight into subject and how work might look. The real focus of the projects in Idaho, however, were the post office murals. There are 6 at post offices throughout the state, and there's also some wonderful examples of work that were done for other federal buildings like courthouses. I'm showing you on the left some relief sculptures that are on the front of the Boundary County Courthouse in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. And then on the right is a really special mural that's in the Blackfoot, Idaho post office. Now, most of these murals were painted by white artists, and often they could be subjects that were about maybe native peoples of the US, but from their own lens and their own viewpoint. And where the Blackfoot, Idaho post office mural is unusual is that it was actually painted by a Native American artist and about life that he knew and knew well. It's also unusual in that it spreads all around the lobby of the post office. So you'll see in this image at the bottom, center, and off to the right, these sort of pieces of wood. And those are actually door frames and window frames because this mural runs all the way around the walls of the lobby in this post office. So you're just seeing a detail, but I hope that you can see some of the wonderful daily details and little bits and pieces about life there that are shown in this image. Now, I promised in the title of this lecture to also talk about some of the blunders in the projects. We tend to focus on all the really wonderful things that were created and these beautiful works and these real sort of triumphs of artwork that you can find in different places, or maybe that are charming or fun. But I also wanted to sort of point out that some of them, it's not always the best product that you get at the end of these projects. And this mural for the Kellogg, Idaho post office is one of those stories. So the image you'll see on the left is the study that the artist Fletcher Martin actually did for this mural. And he had these wonderful plans. It's a striking image. It's really dynamic. It's this beautiful kind of 1930s modernist work. And it's the scene of an accident in one of the mines. And Kellogg is a serious coal mining district. But when he sent the sketch and shared it with the Chamber of Commerce in Kellogg and some of the other government officials, they got very upset. They didn't want their post office to have this image that was of a man being injured in the mine when so many people in the town worked in the mines, and they certainly didn't want to kind of remind people that there were dangers and problems in the mines. So they complained to the administration in Washington, and the artist was asked to change his commission. Now, Fletcher Martin was really popular. He had a lot of projects going on, and he also tended to react to criticism by getting very annoyed and kind of phoning things in. So the mural he chose to do in response to those criticisms is a much less exciting piece. It's sort of a confusing composition. You can't really tell what is going on. The figures are sort of wooden, and it's really not as lively or wonderful as it would have been if there hadn't been that interference in the subject matter. The subject that he's showing is the founder of the town finding the vein of coal that helps found the town for the mines, but I'm not sure you can get that idea from the way the picture looks. Now in Montana, again, it's a slightly different focus there as well. Again, it's been harder to find information on artworks or to find artworks. There's more there and more happening there, but again, still limited right now. I strongly believe there's probably more to find, but at this moment, this is what we know. There were 2 main focuses there. One was the post offices again, and the other was something called a community art center, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But the post offices, again, there are 6 throughout the state. And actually, it's a really great road trip if you want to take it to visit them. Most of them are still in post office lobbies and available to you as the public. And they're just off major interstates. So you can kind of do a beautiful loop around the state and see them. There's a wide variety. There are sort of the typical scenes that you find a lot in these images, which are a style of painting called American scene painting, where it's about the everyday life that you find throughout the US. And usually there's a little bit of a regional characteristic worked into it as well, so that you know you're maybe in Maine, or you're in Oregon, or you're somewhere in the Midwest. There's also often a real emphasis on pioneer history. They love to sort of celebrate this mythical story of how the West, the big empty West, was founded and settled. And it's a very popular theme in these. And of course, in the Northwest, you see a lot of lumbering stories, images of Paul Bunyan and images of logging camps and things like that. So I'm showing you this one mural that's in the post office in Glasgow, Montana. It's one of my favorites because it sort of encapsulates all those things in a single image, and it's a really beautiful, striking painting. So you can see around the outside edges, there are all these figures in this sort of blue haze, which is meant to suggest history. So these are events from the past of this community. So you see pioneers, you see settlers, you see explorers. You also see buffalo, and you see one Native American figure on the upper left. So again, this suggestion that they're gone from the land, that their history is over, which is a constant theme and part of this myth in these post office murals. But then at the center, you see in bright colors all the things, again, to remind this very poor community that was being impacted heavily during the Depression, that here were all the things that they could rely on to bring themselves back once the Depression was over. You can see the riches of the farmland, the stock and ranching life, and in the background, that big structure in the back center is the dam in the area that had just been built. You can see a train and an airplane. There are just all these industries and things that are going to help revitalize the area. You'll see, actually, interestingly, in this one on the center left in the colorful part, some teepees as well. So this is one of the few murals that doesn't suggest that all of the native peoples in the area are gone, never to return, but actually recognizes that they are still there. Now, community art centers were a very specific and interesting aspect of the Federal Art Project. I mentioned early on how they really wanted to get art to everyone, get everyone interested in this national culture, and art centers were one way to do that. So they would found them in smaller towns where maybe they didn't have the sort of resources of a big city. So here in Oregon, it was Salem was the main art center, and then there were some extension galleries. And these centers were completely free. You could go and you could see an exhibition that was free, you could take an art class, you could make something yourself, and they were also available as community spaces. So you could come have your meeting there, or you could go there to hear a lecture or something like that. And they brought in artists not only from the state that needed jobs, but they brought them in from other states sometimes. So they became this interesting crossing ground for artists and influences back and forth. Now, they founded one in Montana, in Butte, Montana. And I'm showing you on the right an image of what Butte looked like in 1939. And you can see it's very much a sort of, it's all about the mining. You can see all those derricks and towers in the background. Those all mark mine shafts right in the center of town, right in among the houses. And this was a town that was very much working class and nitty-gritty. It had a very active red light district. It was just sort of not a town where you'd say, there, they want an art center. But they founded one in an old school, which is the picture on the left. And it was wildly successful because it turns out that not only were the people who lived there really hungry for something different, but also that all these different people came from all over the world to this mining district because of the mines. And they actually ended up with this incredible, not only number of people that came, but the visitor log records people from all over, from Asia, from Europe, and from all over the United States. They also opened extension galleries in Montana, in other towns. And just to sort of quote some statistics, that for 1 year alone, they saw 17,000 people come to the one in Butte. And if you add in the extension galleries in the rest of the state, 65,000 people visited here in 1939. So it was really a phenomenal success. Now there's one really particular project in Montana that was very special, and that unfortunately only this book that I'm showing you on the screen was created for. There was this plan to do books that documented the history and the lore of each of the tribes that were based in Montana. And the decision was made that they would use both a native writer and a native artist to illustrate the book. So really unusual in this moment in time to embrace those voices and to give them a platform to talk about their history and show it and talk about it in the way that they personally would want to do the book. So this one was written by William Larpenteur Long, and the artist was William Standing. And they created this beautiful book that talked about the history of the Cinnabon people in Montana. The federal art projects in Oregon and Washington were really extensive. Actually, all 4 projects were extensive. So a lot of the images I've been showing you and that you'll see as we go on are from those projects. And they're really a variety of work. Again, you'll see that really show up in these images. There's sculpture, there's paintings, there's ceramics like this incredible owl on the right here from the Portland Art Museum's collection. But you'll also notice, as we go through and I'm talking about it, that there are these interesting relationships. So there's work being created for the tax-supported institutions we talked about before, schools, post offices, government buildings. But there's also this really interesting relationship that develops in the Northwest with the military bases and creating work for them, and also with the universities. There's a really strong relationship and a lot of work created for campuses in both Oregon and Washington. The image on the left here is one of those works that was done for Tongue Point Naval Air Station out of Astoria, Oregon, where a woman who was really interested in the history of the Navy did a series of images of ships being built and launched. Now, the Public Works of Art project in Oregon and Washington, like the other states, was really, again, this sort of effort to get work for the government and get money into the hands of artists as quickly as possible. And there's a real variety of work. So on the left, I'm showing you this wonderful mural that is unfortunately now lost that was created for the University of Oregon Medical School. So there's a commission, again, for the university and for a public spot. And it's about the history of medicine. So there are these figures sort of struggling out from what's supposed to be the bottom and the darkness, which is ignorance, and into knowledge and into light, and bringing this new knowledge about medicine with them. And I love this picture because I love all the nurses standing around, clearly posed, but it's a wonderful picture of sort of nurses from that period of time and their clothing, and admiring this artwork that has been added to the hospital where they work. I also talked about how these projects were about trying to preserve people's skills. So there was this real concern that as the Depression dragged on and people weren't employed, that they would lose some of their abilities just from not being able to practice them every day. We all know how there's a skill that if you don't keep doing it or thinking about it or writing in a particular way, you kind of get rusty. And so they wanted to make sure this didn't happen with artists. And the work on the right is a really particularly interesting find from the research I've been doing the past couple of years. This woman actually had come over from England. She's a trained illuminator, and she had been doing heraldry for the English royal family. And when she was employed on the project in Washington, they asked her to create a series of illuminated pages for the Seattle Art Museum that they could exhibit. So she did copies of pages from works like the Book of Kells or from other famous medieval manuscripts. And they're really just beautiful. They're on imitation vellum, like a medieval piece would have been, and just beautifully detailed. So really unusual, not what you would expect to find on the project, but here they are employing an artist and making sure that their skills carry on during this time when there is no other work. Now, the post offices in Oregon and Washington, there are lots and lots of them. And again, I'd encourage you to get out on the road or to pay attention when you're driving around. If you see one, to stop and go in and look. There's a huge variety in Washington in particular. There are 18 in the state, all through the state, and you can see everything you might imagine. So I'm showing you 2 from Washington State in this image. The top one is one of those scenes that you'd expect. It's that American scene, it's daily life in this region, and it's about the lumber industry. So I think these are the best oxen that I've ever seen in a mural in a post office. I love this mural for the ox on the left there in particular. but just again, that sort of scene painting. And again, that piece of wood there in the bottom, that's the door. So the mural is up over the door of the postmaster's office. The other image I'm showing you is really unusual, and I included it because I talk about variety, but I want you to really see it. And there were some oversight, as I talked about with the Kellogg, Idaho post office, there's some oversight from the committees that chose the post office murals as to subject and how they might look. But sometimes the committees were really comfortable with something different being done for their town. And this piece by Douglas Nicholson that's in the Camas, Washington post office is really different and really unusual. It's an allegory about settling the West. It's called Beginning of a New World. And it's just this strange, interesting, abstract design with these figures sort of embedded in these waving trees and this very unusual landscape. And I know the colors look strange in this image, but that's really what it looks like in real life. Very muted, very limited palette of colors. And again, another one well worth seeing if you get a chance, because it's very unusual in this sense. Oregon also has a number of wonderful post office murals. There's about 9 in the state. And again, this variety that's going to talk to either the history of the region, like the work on the left that talks about Newburgh, and there's a real interest in the post office murals to capture the history of the mail and mail delivery. So you'll see a lot of images that look at that. And this piece by Rockwell Carey that's in the Newburgh post office, he tries to kind of include everything that might have been a way of delivering the mail. So you see pony expresses and you see boats on the river and you see a train, and a little bit of everything in there to capture it. And the image on the right by Carl Morris is one of 2 panels that are in the former Eugene post office. Again, that look at, this one's agriculture, the other one is about the lumber industry. And I wanted to share these 2 in particular because they both kind of get to the heart of what's been happening with these murals as they've lived in these communities since the 1930s. So in the work on the left, for example, when I went to go visit this post office and was looking at the piece and taking some pictures, the postmaster came out to talk to me. And he told me this elaborate story about how this painting had been painted in the 1970s, and this was the postmaster whose name he knew, and it was a history of the town. And he gave me this whole history that was completely fake for this painting. And you could see in the right-hand corner, clear eye view, that this work is dated 1937, and he kept insisting that it was a contemporary work. And it was fascinating to me because it had clearly become so much a part of the life of that town that they've made up their own story that included a postmaster they all knew to be part of that. And the one on the right I wanted to include because the issue with these post office murals now is that many of these buildings are being closed down, post office branches, and that means the murals are now in peril in various ways. Depending on who they sell the building to, sometimes the mural can stay in place, but in others it becomes a real issue. And the Eugene Post Office, one of those that's in limbo right now, it just was closed as a branch, and we really don't know what's going to happen with these murals. So we're hoping they can be transferred out of there into a better situation. Now, just to revisit another blunder, and also to give you a little more insight into the process for how these murals were chosen and how they were organized, I wanted to look at this one from Burns, Oregon by Jack Wilkinson. So for the trap and the section, these 2 projects that are for decorating public buildings, there were committees that decided what artist was going to be chosen and what subject. So you'd enter your work into a competition, and then they'd select you based on the drawings you had turned in for the competition. And you could be from anywhere. So you could have submitted from Minnesota and end up doing a post office in Oregon. It just depended on where they landed the commission. So Jack Wilkinson, who was chosen for this mural, which is in the Burns, Oregon post office, way out in eastern Oregon, he was from New York City. And he had proposed to do, first of all, he went way out of the line and wanted to show a massacre of people, a historical massacre. And the committee said, no, we don't want that on our post office wall. So he came back to something about ranching life. He wanted to do something about ranching. The problem was he was born and raised in New York City. He had never seen a cow in his life or been anywhere near a ranch. And he was trying to do these studies in this mural from his apartment in New York. So they made him travel out to Burns and actually go to a cattle roundup and see what was happening. And then he painted the mural at the post office, up on a scaffold in the post office. And every day, the ranchers would come in and out and critique the mural and tell him, ropes don't look like that. Does not look right. You wouldn't hold a branding iron that way. And the man ended up reworking the whole mural based on this sort of community committee input rather than on his own sketches. So that by the time it was done, the community was happy with what they had in their post office. Now, the federal art project in Oregon and Washington, the scope was huge. There was so much work created of all sorts of variety. And I'm showing you two extremes here. So on the left is an image of these huge concrete pieces that were done for a tunnel that was being built on the interstate out of Seattle. So it's not the whole bridge that was part of the commission, but these relief panels that you can see that were inset into it, that were created by the Federal Art Project for this major construction project. So again, that sort of intersection of other projects with the art project. Any way you can employ them, they're going to try and get them to help out. And then on the right is a painting. Again, what you might expect, there'd be paintings coming out of this project, but a really different subject and a very different style. So the Federal Art Project, in contrast to those mural projects for the post offices, didn't have the same oversight. It was really about whatever the regional administrators were comfortable with. So if an artist was interested maybe in a different, more unique style, here in this Louis Bunce painting, he's really looking at surrealism and cubism in this work. It was okay for him to experiment. He wasn't forced into that other style that was more detailed and that was that American scene, sort of day-to-day life. So there's a whole arc and variety of what's created. Now, the project was really slow to get started in Washington State, and that's another one of those interesting moments we don't necessarily talk about with these projects, and it was because of local politics. So kind of how you got the money and how the projects got the money was through many different government bureaucracies that intersected. And the man who controlled the money for Washington State was very conservative. He hated modern art. And when he was asked to give money to the art project in Washington State, he said, no, we're not going to have any of that modern stuff here in the state of Washington. And he refused to give them money. So for the first year and a half of those projects, Washington didn't have a project. It just sat there. And then thankfully, finally, they got that administrator moved to a different job, and they were able to begin the projects. But it's this interesting piece to the projects for me, that it's about art and it's about employing people, but there's also all these other factors that are involved that intersect with larger issues, such as the politics of these projects. Now, there's a lot of commissions for universities in Washington and Oregon, as I mentioned previously. I'm showing you here a mural that's on the campus of the University of Washington in Seattle in their chemistry department building. And it's a really glorious piece. It's all in tile mosaic. So when you look at the details, you'll see all those little different bits of colors or tiles that have been pulled together to create this really detailed mosaic. And it's about the history of chemistry. So that's why this sort of fantastical version out of Egypt on the left, and then on the right is modern chemistry, including in the details there's the atom and these formulas that talk about new discoveries in chemistry in the 1930s and later on in the century. This one too was an interesting one, chosen by committee because the design had to be approved by all the members of the faculty of the chemistry department. And it took 5 years to get to a final decision before the artist could actually begin work on this artwork. So again, some of these strange little hiccups and ups and downs of these projects that you might not know about with them. So this mural is in the lobby of the chemistry building at the University of Washington in Seattle, and very easy for you to visit if you're interested. For Oregon State, it was the University of Oregon in particular that received a lot of work from the projects. That's partly because, of course, Burt Brown Barker, my hero from the projects that we saw earlier, he's the vice president there. So he has this wonderful connection to the university and make sure whenever there's an opportunity that the art projects get employed. So the library, as I mentioned, was just being built. So there's a lot of work in the stairwells and in the different rooms of the library. I'm showing you on the left a piece of this very large mural that's in one stairwell at the university. There's a matching piece in the other stairwell by Arthur Runquist and his brother and another artist, Martina Gangle, that is called The Tree of Knowledge. Really jam-packed with details. And again, that sort of setup where you start from kind of darkness and ignorance and build your way up to knowledge. There's also sculptures all over the front of the building by the artists whose sculpture I'm showing you in this image. This is a freestanding one that lives in one of the reference rooms of the library. If you visit Oregon State University's campus or the University of Oregon, and you see the beautiful wrought iron gates at the entrances, or even around like the fields and things. Those too are WPA projects. So really any kind of work and variety, you could find it on these projects. There's also a lot of work that's done for public schools, as you might expect, and they're usually smaller works that can go onto the walls of classrooms, but there are also some murals and things. I'm showing you some of both of those in this image. On the left, it's hard to see that, of course, from a slide, but this is an enormous mural, one of two for the Rose City Park School in Portland. It's 9 feet high and 12 feet wide, and it was made for the auditorium at the school. And what's interesting about murals for the project is that they were painted on canvas for the most part and then glued to the wall, rather than painted like true fresco directly on the wall. And that has come to be a real advantage now many years later, because if there's the need to take them down or move them, you can take that canvas off the wall, stretch it like you would a canvas you might find in the museum, and then move them around. So this, if you get to see the show here at Hallie Ford, you'll get to see this big mural in person. And there's nothing like sort of coming up on one of these in its real scale to be sort of overawed by the story and the drama of this image, which is about settlers coming down the Columbia River on a very flimsy looking raft. And then on the right is a print that was done and distributed to a number of schools in Washington State. It's that sort of, I talked about, not only are you going to talk about the lumber industry, but you're going to revisit some of the stories around it. So Paul Bunyan is really popular in the Northwest, this sort of fictional lumberman giant with his big blue ox called Babe. So you see a lot of images, and this is one of my favorites of him from Washington State, because it's just got this great look to it, sort of cartoony, but also really wonderful and evocative. There's also, of course, lots of work done for other organizations. There's an agreement that's made later in the projects as money starts to get tighter, where different organizations can, what they call co-sponsor a work. They can provide some funds, and then the government also will, in that way, get to the project. And that's how this mural came about. And this one that you're seeing to me is one of the great losses of the Federal Art Project in Washington State. This was painted for the Cushman Indian Hospital in Puyallup, Washington, which is just south of Tacoma. And it was a really magnificent work. It was done for the dining room of the hospital. I'm only showing you a piece of it. It actually stretched all the way around the walls. And again, it's unique in that the artist was Native American and was allowed to choose a subject and symbols and a look that to him was his own creation, instead of it being dictated to him. And it's this very dramatic piece that he created, stretches all the way around the dining room. And sadly, even as he was painting it, there were issues with this building. It was a new build, but something was not quite right. And he had to go back in and repaint parts of the mural. And then just a few years later, it became so hazardous to be in the building, they had to close it down. And the mural was destroyed along with the building when the building was destroyed. So all we have are a few photographs of it now, unfortunately, but it really was a glorious commission. Community art centers were also important in Oregon and Washington. There were 3 in Oregon State. There's one in Salem, there's one over in Gold Beach on the coast of Oregon, and then one out in eastern Oregon in La Grande. And they, again, were these gathering points for people and also crossroads for artists. So you'll see that there are a number of artists that come to these art centers to teach, that then stay in the area and become important figures in the Northwest. And we'll talk about a few in just a minute. But also just wanted to reemphasize the importance of these places as places where the community could gather and see art or make art or talk about art. And Salem's and La Grande and Gold Beach, they were all equally popular. And in fact, the one in Gold Beach became a sort of stop along the Pacific Coast Highway for people that were traveling up and down. Now in Washington State, there was one main one, and that was out in Spokane. And that one also became a really pivotal center. It became one of the most active in the United States, actually, despite the more limited population and harder access to get there in that point of time. And again, a real crossroads for people and centers. I'm showing you some images that were part of a major find a couple of years ago that turned out to be photography of all these projects that had been lost. So these negatives were found in a basement in a couple of cardboard boxes and turned out to document the whole history of these projects in the Northwest. And these are some of the images from that. A really wonderful record that have helped us identify people and artists, as well as just see what the life was like at these centers. Now, the artwork that was being made at these centers, some of it was someone like me maybe coming in off the street and creating an artwork. But there's also these professional artists who were teaching there and making work at the same time, sometimes on their own and sometimes with students. So on the left, I'm showing you a print by the artist Vanessa Helder, who was a really important figure at the Spokane Art Center in Washington. She really wanted to teach others about printmaking, so she managed to get a press donated to the center. She set up a whole training program, and it became a real focus of the projects out there. And then on the right is a piece that was by Louis Bunce and a number of his students. And Louis Bunce is a figure in Oregon art who becomes really pivotal through his teaching at the Portland Museum Art School. But he starts out as one of the teachers really here at the center. And one of his students also becomes a well-known artist in Oregon later on, Clifford Gleason. And together they created these murals for one of the schools in Salem. And I love the story of these as well because they were in an elementary school. They had to be rescued because of construction and other issues with the murals. And they tried to put them back into an elementary school back about 15 years ago, I think now. And they felt that they were too scary now for elementary school students. So they ended up in a high school instead. But they are here in Salem and in beautiful shape. There are these wonderful sort of fantasies of Alice in Wonderland, as you can see. These works that I'm showing you are examples of two artists who really got their start on the projects here in the Northwest and through the community art centers in particular. So on the left is photographer Minor White. Minor White is one of the most important modernist photographers of the 20th century in the United States. But when he came to Oregon as a young man in the 1930s, he had just really been doing photography as a hobby a little bit. And he joined the YWCA in Portland and helped start a photography club and got interested more and more in the idea of doing the work. And the art project there in Portland decided to hire him to help document activities on the projects and then began to support his creative work. And it's through that support and the access to a darkroom and equipment that Minor White began to blossom as an artist who used photography as his medium. He goes on to run the LeGrand Art Center out in Eastern Oregon, and then goes to California and moves on with his career. But his launching point as a photographer is here on the art projects in the Northwest. The painting on the right is by the artist Morris Graves, and he's another one who got his start on the projects. He's well known now as an important figure in Northwest art history. He's one of the 4 artists known as the Northwest Mystics, who had this very particular style of work that became nationally popular and celebrated in the middle of the 20th century. But he gets his start on the project in Washington State and really gets to experiment as a painter here. Again, gets the support, the time, the place, the materials to create works. So this is one of the earliest known paintings by Morris Graves, and it's from the projects. It's now in the collection of the Seattle Art Museum. Now, there's definitely these sort of themes and ideas that carry throughout the United States that happen through the federal projects. I've been kind of touching upon them as I went. This interest in American scene painting, this interest in celebrating regional culture or resources, these sort of broader ideas about sharing culture. But there are some specific things here in the Northwest that are unique to the Northwest. And one of those I'm showing you here is what you might expect. And that's the real interest in using media that are traditionally defined as craft to create artwork. So in the Northwest, of course, we have access to lots of wonderful wood, active timber industry, so wood was also coming in from other places, including from Asia and from Europe and from other countries, and was just readily available here. So you see a lot of really wonderful work in wood here in the Northwest. There's one artist in particular whose work is on the left, Amy Gorham, who begins working in wood marquetry. And that's a style, if you've seen inlay in furniture where a design's been set into furniture with different colors of wood, that's marquetry work. But she takes that technique and goes full-scale architectural size with it. So she's doing pieces that are wall panels or that cover entire walls around entrance doors and things like that. Just really incredible. So if you look at the details of this piece, all those different colors, all those details are little pieces of wood that have been arranged together to create that picture and that beautiful illusion that you're seeing in this work. There are also artists who have a skill as a craftsman who then become artists through the project and the support of the project. So Valentine Weiss, the piece on the right, is one of those artists that I'm showing you. He was a really skilled woodworker and furniture maker, and they hired him to create sculpture on the project. And so he learned to carve decorative objects as well and created this incredible piece that you can see on the right, which is a relief plaque in wood. He took a single big chunk of Oregon white oak and carved that whole sculpture of Pegasus out of that single piece of wood. It's also in the show that will be at Hallie Ford's. I hope you get to see it in person. It's really incredible, the detail and the depth of this work. Now, the real sort of pinnacle of all of that is Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood here in Oregon. And again, it's one of those places, if you haven't seen it, you have got to go. It's a working ski lodge now, but it's also a sort of living national museum. And you can go and just walk around the lodge and see all of the amazing things that were created for it. There was a plan to create a ski lodge for the mountain that intersected with the art project here in Oregon. And one of the administrators on the art project had experience as an interior decorator. So she really began to advocate for the art projects to get involved with the construction of Timberline Lodge. And she managed, through her enthusiasm, to get everyone to sign off on the art project really overseeing the whole decorative scheme for the lodge. So not just the artworks on the walls, but everything about it, the furniture, the newel posts on the stairwells, the fireplaces, the wrought iron pieces that were made. It was all a scheme that was come up with through the art project, and it was all done by artisans that were hired for the project. So she started up these workshops where there would be iron workers in need of work who had been working construction and didn't have the jobs anymore. She started up a workshop to teach them how to do decorative wrought iron, and they did things for Timberline Lodge. She did the same with women who were textile workers, men who were carpenters, stonemasons. And so the interior of the lodge today, everything in there, from the rugs to the artwork on the walls, was handmade on the projects and is still available for you to see. So if you really want to kind of experience what it would have felt like and what that aesthetic was like in the 1930s on these projects in the Northwest, go to Timberline Lodge and you can walk straight into the middle of it and really enjoy the beauty that is there in that lodge. This is another one of the sort of blunder stories that we've uncovered over the years in the projects. This mural is one of two panels that were done for Timberline Lodge originally, but the artist, C.S. Price, was really interested in cubism and a different form of painting, modernist painting. He worked a lot with a palette knife, so if you think of the squared off edge of a palette knife, you'll see that when you look at the details of his painting, that it's not brush strokes, but it's these squared off sort of strokes that gave him a different line and edge to his work. But the man who was in charge of the Timberline Lodge for the Forest Service really was uncomfortable with this style of art. It was too modern for him. He didn't get it. He thought the colors were strange, and he rejected the mural and wouldn't take them for the lodge. So for a long time, they were bumped off to another home. And then thankfully, decades later, when the lodge was restored, the administrators now recognize that these were incredible artworks and have taken them back to the lodge, so you can see them there. But again, that strange intersection of art and politics, that's a real integral piece of these federal art projects. One of the other sort of unique Northwest contributions was one of the branches of what was called the Graphic Arts Project. So these were set up across the US. There were only a few, and one of them landed at the office in Seattle. The Graphic Art Project was just what it sounds like. It was designed to take printmakers and preserve those skills again and bring those skills to the idea of making artwork. So going from perhaps having made posters or ads or things like that to creating artworks through printmaking, and also to innovate both in terms of styles that they already knew or to revive older ones. And one of those branches in Seattle was wildly popular and very successful, and a lot of interesting prints were made on the Seattle projects, and a real variety. So again, I'm showing you two that give you an idea of maybe some of the variety that you could see. I also wanted to note the one on the left is by the artist Fei Chong, who is an artist of Chinese descent working on the projects. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but really there is a very limited number of artists who are not white on the projects. And that is a real failing and problem of these projects, that they were supposed to be art for all and support art for all, but it really was not all the artists who were in need that were employed. The one on the right is by the artist Agatha Kirsch, who was, actually that's a picture of some of the artists there in the studio in Seattle where they were all making prints there at work. So it's a great record, the artists that work in the studio kind of capturing their own life in their work. So in looking back at what we've been discussing here in the lecture and what I've been learning over the years, there's this question of like, did the projects do as they proposed? They had very big ideas and very big hopes, but did they really reach them? I'm showing you here some of those images that have been part of that discovery I mentioned of photographs from the projects that show artists at work. And again, yes, in that sense, absolutely. They provided jobs for all kinds of different artists. They gave them work and opportunities at a moment where there was no other option for them. And the files at the National Archives from the projects are full of letters from artists just writing in gratitude to the president, to Eleanor Roosevelt, and to project administrators, just to say how grateful they were to have had their work treated with respect and to have it be understood that they too needed employment and could do something that could contribute in this difficult time. We certainly hear from letters and articles and newspapers as well that people really appreciated this artwork in their community. That idea that it could be something that raised morale or that shared art that might not have been available to them before was really important to people. So in those ways, absolutely the projects met their targets. And in this idea of preserving skills. So we've hit upon a couple of those talking through. So artists maybe who were iron workers were able to do other kinds of work in iron for the projects instead of on construction because there was no job. Or the illuminator we looked at, for example, a very particular, very unique skill, but they found a way for her to do work on the projects. So I mentioned in passing the question of whether these projects really met the goal of offering opportunities for all and really embracing all. The administrators talked a great deal about that being one of the goals that they hoped the projects would reach, was to make art a part of everyday life, but also that everybody could enjoy it and everybody could see themselves in it in their daily lives. And that is unfortunately part of the projects that didn't live up to the goal. For women artists, there's fairly good opportunities. We see almost about a 40% employment rate among women on the projects, which is pretty amazing for artists, women artists in that period of time, that they also were receiving professional support. And the painting on the right is by a really wonderful figure, Dora Erickson, who was working out of Portland and doing these great American scene pictures of images from the Midwest. But on the left is a work by the artist Kamekichi Tokita, who was of Japanese descent. And we find in looking at the list of over 600 artists or so that we've pulled together so far, that really artists who are of different backgrounds are not part of that list. So there's a few artists of Asian descent, there's a few Native American artists who we've talked about some of today, and there's only 2 black artists that have been identified to date in those lists. So the opportunities for all were unfortunately primarily only for artists who were white. And we've looked at some of the images too, that many of the images shown were really also images of what was happening for white people in their daily lives. You don't see other people of color in those images, and particularly the representations of Native American life and history are very much skewed by sort of mythical ideas. So in that sense, the projects did not live up to their aspirations. And it's something now that's actually becoming problematic for some of the public murals today, that their subject matters no longer match where we want to be today, and some of them are being removed from schools and public institutions because of that fact. Now, I mentioned a couple of times throughout this talk that there are opportunities for you to go see this work, and I would strongly encourage you to go out in your community and to go looking for it, because it's great fun to discover it in a post office or just to see it yourself. So I'm listing at the top of this slide a website called livingnewdeal.org, which is an incredible resource. They have for several decades now been pulling together an inventory of all the work from the various federal art projects all over the United States. So you can go by state and then by city and find what's in your area. It also will give you some details about who the artist was, whether you can visit and get into a building to see it, and where you'll find it in the building. So it's a great place to go look if you're interested in exploring. There are a couple of museums in the area that also have work. The Portland Art Museum has quite a collection of Northwest art from the federal art projects, and usually has a number of works on view. You can, of course, come see the exhibition at the Hallie Ford Museum of Art to see work here. Timberline Lodge we've talked about, the university campuses around Oregon. And lastly, I'd really encourage you to visit your regional post office and see if you can find one of these murals yourself. You may have been passing it by for years and not noticing it was there, and it's really great fun to see them in person and in the context for which they were created. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you get a chance to experience some of this New Deal art in person.